Not on purpose. Not in a way anybody could hold against you. But there is a story you've been telling yourself about your own life, and you've told it so many times that it feels like the truth now. It goes something like this. Something is wrong with me. That's the lie. And before this is over, I'm going to take it apart piece by piece, until there's nothing left of it, and you're standing there with the actual truth in your hands, wondering how you carried the counterfeit for so long. My name is George. I've been walking with God long enough to know the difference between a person who is broken and a person who is buried. They look identical from the outside. They feel identical from the inside. But one of them is dying, and the other one is about to come up through the dirt. Let me tell you what I mean by buried. There's a plant that grows out where the ground goes hard and rocky, and you can look at that stretch of earth in the middle of a dry season and swear nothing is alive down there. Flat, gray, cracked. But under one of those stones, in the dark, where nobody is watching and nothing is happening, there's a root. And that root is doing the slowest, most stubborn work in all of creation. It is pushing, not fast, not dramatically, just relentlessly, day after day, against a weight that has no business losing. And one day the stone moves. Not because the root got angry, because the root never stopped. That's you. That's what I need you to understand before we go one sentence further. The reason your life doesn't look like the lives around you isn't because you were skipped. It's because you were planted deeper. Now let's start pulling the lie apart. The first piece of the lie. You think your solitude is a punishment. Let me ask you something. How many times have you sat in a room full of people and felt like you were watching them through glass? Everybody's laughing. Everybody's talking about the game, about the sale at the store, about what somebody's cousin said at the barbecue. And you're right there, nodding, smiling at the right moments, and there is a part of you standing about 10 feet behind your own body. Quiet, watching, waiting for the conversation to become real. And it never does. You go home, you lie down, and that ache shows up. Not sadness exactly. Something more like homesickness for a place you've never been. You've decided that means you're antisocial, or difficult, or that you never learned how to be a person the way everybody else learned it. Here is what it actually means. Solitude isn't a hole in your life. It's a room. And God built it on purpose. Because there are things He will only say to you when there's nobody else in there. Think about Elijah for a second. Here's a man who had just stood on a mountain and called fire out of the sky in front of a whole nation. The biggest public moment in his ministry. Everybody saw it. Everybody talked about it. And what happens next? He runs. He runs into the wilderness and sits under a tree and asks God to take his life. That's how the story goes. The most spectacular day of his life is immediately followed by the loneliest. And God doesn't scold him for it. God feeds him, lets him sleep, and then leads him deeper into the emptiness to a cave, alone in a rock. And the wind came, tearing the mountains apart, and God wasn't in the wind. The earthquake came, and God wasn't in the earthquake. The fire came, and this is the same man who had just seen God answer with fire, and God wasn't in the fire. Then a whisper. Barely anything. A thin, quiet voice in the mouth of a cave. That's where God was. Do you understand what that story is telling you? God had already proven He could speak in fire. He didn't need to prove it again. What He needed was for Elijah to be somewhere quiet enough to hear the other voice, the one that doesn't perform, doesn't announce itself, and doesn't compete with noise. You cannot hear a whisper in a crowd. That is not a metaphor. That is just physics, and it is also spiritual law. Your solitude was never a curse. It was acoustics. And I want to press on this a little harder, because I know what happens the second you hear that. You nod, you agree with it, and then Friday night comes and the loneliness shows up anyway, and none of it feels true. So let me be plain about what solitude actually costs, and why God asks it of certain people. There's a difference between being alone and being isolated. Isolation is what happens when you get cut off from people who love you, and it starves you. Solitude is what happens when God clears the room on purpose, because you have been outsourcing your discernment to everyone else, and He needs it back. Think about how much of what you believe about yourself came from someone else's mouth. Your mother's assessment of you at 14, what a teacher said in front of the class, the thing your ex said during the worst argument you ever had, the one you still hear in his voice, word for word, 10 years later. You have been carrying other people's verdicts around as if they were the record, and God cannot correct a verdict you keep listening to. So He turns down the volume on everybody else. That is what the wilderness is. Not punishment, just the removal of every voice that isn't His. So that when He finally says who you are, there's nothing in the room to argue with Him. It is uncomfortable. I won't pretend otherwise. There is a particular kind of ache that comes from being in a season where nobody understands what's happening to you, and you can't explain it without sounding unstable. You learn to stop trying. You give the short answer. Doing fine. Busy. You know how it is. And you go home and sit in the quiet with the thing you can't say. But hear me, the quiet is not empty. It only sounds empty because you were trained to measure a room by how much noise is in it. Elijah sat in a cave that had nothing in it, and the most important conversation of his life happened there. The second piece of the lie. You think you're too sensitive. Somebody told you that once, didn't they? Maybe it was a parent. Maybe a spouse. Maybe a boss who was tired of your questions. You're too sensitive. You overthink everything. You take things too hard. And you believed it. You've spent years trying to sand it down, trying to care less, trying to develop that thick skin everybody keeps recommending. Let me tell you what you actually have. You have discernment. And discernment is not a personality flaw. It's an instrument. You walk into a house, and within 90 seconds you know something is off between the two people living there. And neither of them said a word about it. You get a phone call from a friend who says, "I'm fine," and you know she isn't. And you're right. You sit across from a man at a table and something in your chest tightens and you can't explain it, and 6 months later you find out exactly why. That's not anxiety. That's not you being dramatic. That is a spiritual instrument that God installed in you and never bothered to give you the manual for. And here's the part that's costing you. Because nobody told you it was a gift, you've been treating it like a malfunction. You second-guess it. You override it. Somebody tells you you're imagining things, and you apologize and go along with it. And then you watch the thing you sensed unfold exactly the way you sensed it. And instead of trusting yourself more, you just feel sick. Stop apologizing for the instrument. The root under the stone doesn't apologize for pushing. It doesn't ask the rock for permission. It just knows which direction the light is. And it goes. I knew a man once who worked the night shift at a warehouse outside of town. Big man. Quiet. Hands like he'd been born holding something heavy. He came to me one afternoon in the parking lot after his shift, still in his vest, and he was rattled in a way I'd never seen from him. He said there was a young guy on his crew, 19, 20 years old, and something about him had been sitting wrong in his chest for weeks. Nothing you could point to. The kid showed up, did his work, laughed at the right jokes, but every time this man walked past him, He felt like he'd walked past a live wire. He said, "I don't have anything on him." I'd sound crazy. I told him he didn't need evidence. He needed obedience. I said, "Don't accuse the boy of anything. Just get close to him." So he did. Started taking his break at the same time. Started asking about his weekend, his family. Nothing heavy. Took about a month before the kid said anything real. And when he finally did, it came out that he'd been sleeping in his car for 6 weeks and had made a decision about how he was going to end things. And he had a date picked. That man's chest tightening in a warehouse aisle was not anxiety. Now, understand what almost happened. He almost talked himself out of it. He almost decided he was being paranoid, that it wasn't his business, that a grown man doesn't act on a feeling. And the only reason he didn't is that somebody told him the feeling was an instrument and not a malfunction. How many times has God tried to move you and you filed it under overthinking? That's what the lie costs. It isn't just that you feel bad about yourself. It's that the instrument goes unused, and somebody who needed it stands in a parking lot with nobody coming. The third piece of the lie. You think you're behind. This one's the heaviest, so let's sit with it. You have a number in your head, an age you were supposed to have it figured out by. A milestone everybody else seems to have crossed. Maybe it's marriage. Maybe it's a house. Maybe it's a career that finally makes sense when you describe it out loud. And every year that passes without it, the lie gets a little louder. You missed it. It already happened, and you weren't ready. And now the window is closed. Let me tell you about a Tuesday night. I was standing in an empty sanctuary, everybody gone. Lights half off, chairs still crooked from Sunday, and there was a woman sitting in the third row, who I thought had left an hour before, 58 years old. She'd been coming to that church for 2 decades, and never once raised her hand for anything. She said to me, "George, I think God forgot my name." I asked her what she meant. She said she'd spent 30 years raising other people's children in her home, foster kids, nieces, a nephew whose mother went to prison, one after another. She said she used to have dreams about what she'd do with her life. And now, she was almost 60, and all she'd done was change sheets and pack lunches and sit up at night with children who weren't hers. I said, "How many?" She didn't understand the question. I said, "How many children came through your house?" She counted on her fingers for a while. She got to 19. I said, "Ma'am, you didn't miss your calling. You've been inside it for 30 years. You just thought it was going to have a title." That's the thing about the root. It doesn't get applause. Nobody stands over that patch of hard ground and claps for the work happening 18 inches down. The applause comes later, when the stone finally moves, and by then everybody assumes it happened overnight. You are not behind. You have been underground. Those are 2 entirely different conditions, and only one of them means anything is wrong. The fourth piece of the lie. You think God is silent because he's disappointed. I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of people quietly give up. There are seasons where you pray and it feels like the words hit the ceiling and slide back down. You read the passages that used to move you, and they read like a phone book. You go to church, and everybody around you seems to be having an encounter, and you're just standing there, thinking about whether you left the stove on. And you conclude that God pulled back because you did something. Let me go back to Elijah, because his story doesn't end at the cave. When God finally speaks to him in that whisper, what does he say? Does he say you failed? Does he say I'm disappointed in you? No. He asks him a question. What are you doing here? And then he gives him 3 assignments. Anoint this king, anoint that king, and find Elisha. The man who will carry everything you've built after you're gone. God didn't meet him in the cave to scold him. God met him in the cave to promote him. The silence wasn't judgment. The silence was the waiting room outside the next assignment. And I'll tell you something else about that story that people skip over. Elijah thought he was the only one left. He said it out loud, "I alone am left." And God corrected him. There are 7,000 who haven't bowed. 7,000 you don't know about. You think you're the only one who feels this way. You are not. There are people scattered across cities and small towns you'll never visit, sitting in kitchens at 4 in the morning, feeling the exact thing you're feeling, thinking they're the only one too. The silence isn't abandonment. It's the sound of something being prepared that you don't have the eyes to see yet. The fifth piece of the lie. You think your hunger is a defect. Nothing satisfies you. That's the honest version, isn't it? You get the thing you wanted, and there's about 3 weeks of relief, and then the ache comes back. The promotion, the relationship, the new place. Everybody around you seems to be able to settle into a life and be content in it, and you keep waking up at 3 a.m. with this restless, unnamed pull, like there's a door somewhere and you can't find the hallway. You've called that ingratitude. You felt guilty about it in prayer. Here's the truth. You are not built to be satisfied by anything that ends. That hunger is a compass. It's the part of you that recognizes counterfeits. Every time you get to the top of something and find it empty, that's not you failing to appreciate your blessings, that's the instrument working correctly, telling you not this. Keep going. Some people are made to be satisfied. God bless them, genuinely. They find a good life, and they live it well, and there is nothing wrong with that. But some people are made to be hungry, because hunger is what makes a person keep walking when the road stops making sense. And God needs people who will keep walking. Let me show you the difference between the two, because I think you've been comparing yourself to the wrong crowd your entire life. Picture a supermarket at 11 at night. Fluorescent lights. One register open. That specific hum the freezers make. There are 2 people in that aisle. One of them is buying milk because they ran out of milk. Simple, clean. They'll be home in 10 minutes and asleep in 40. The other one has been standing in front of the same shelf for 6 minutes and isn't thinking about milk at all. They came out of the house because the walls were too close and they needed somewhere to be. And now they're standing under those lights with the whole weight of their life pressing on them, thinking, is this it? Is this what it is? Both of them are good people. Both of them love God. But only one of them is going to spend the next decade unable to sit still. I have watched people torture themselves trying to be the first one, trying to want less, praying to be made content, as if the restlessness were sin. And it never works, because you cannot pray away a design feature. Every deep thing in Scripture was built by somebody who couldn't settle. Abraham left an entire life behind and never saw the city he was promised. Moses walked out of a palace into 40 years of nothing. Paul got knocked flat on a road and spent the rest of his life on other roads, never staying anywhere long enough to grow comfortable. None of them were satisfied. That was the point. So when the ache comes back 3 weeks after you got the thing you wanted, stop apologizing for it. That's not ingratitude. That's the root finding out the soil is shallow and turning to look for depth. Now let me stop for a moment, because I want to say something honestly. I don't say all of this from a distance. There was a stretch of about 4 years where I got up before the sun every single morning and stood in a cold kitchen with my hands on the counter and could not feel a thing. Not doubt exactly, just static. And in that stretch, I came very close to concluding that everything I believed about myself was a story I'd invented to survive. What got me through wasn't a breakthrough. It was structure. It was finally understanding what season I was standing in, and what that season was for, and roughly how long it goes. There are messages that pass through your eyes, and there are messages that pass through your spirit. If something in you recognized itself while watching, don't dismiss it. That is the Spirit confirming what was already written. The secret protocol carries 7 keys that unveil what heaven deposited in you before you ever arrived, things no one around you has ever been able to name. It comes with the full audiobook for your moments of prayer, silence, and encounter with God. And you also receive the Awakening Map, the guide that illuminates the 5 seasons of spiritual awakening, revealing with precision exactly where you are and what comes next. The link is pinned in the first comment, but only for a limited time. Don't let this moment pass without a response. I put those keys together because nobody handed them to me when I needed them. I had to find them one at a time, in the dark, over years. You don't have to do it that way. The 6th piece of the lie. You think you have to become someone else first. This is the last one, and it's the most stubborn, because it wears the costume of humility. You believe there's a version of you, that God can finally use a version that prays more, sins less, has the anxiety under control, has the past cleaned up, and you've been waiting to become that person before you'll let yourself step into anything. So you don't. You wait. You stay small. You call it humility, but it's really just fear, that learned church vocabulary. Look at who God actually reaches for. He reached for a man hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat where nobody could see him, and called him a mighty warrior before he had done a single thing. He reached for a shepherd boy. His own father didn't bother to call in from the field. He reached for a woman who had been passed over and widowed and left in a foreign country with nothing. He reached for a man who was actively hunting down believers on the road and knocked him off a horse and rebuilt him from the ground up. Not one of them fixed themselves first. Not one. And Elijah, the man we keep coming back to, was, according to Scripture itself, a man with a nature just like ours. Same fears, same exhaustion, same capacity to sit under a tree and want to quit. And he still called down fire, and he still went up in a whirlwind, and his name is still spoken 3,000 years later. You are not disqualified. You are unfinished. Every single person God has ever used was unfinished, and he used them while they were unfinished, because that's the only kind of person there is. Now, let me put the pieces back together, because I've spent this whole time taking something apart, and I don't want to leave you standing in the rubble. 6 things. 6 things you have carried as evidence against yourself, and every one of them is evidence for you. Your solitude, that's the acoustics. That's the room where the whisper is audible. Your sensitivity, that's the instrument. That's discernment God installed before you could name it. Your delay, that's depth. That's root work under a stone nobody thinks to look under. The silence, that's the waiting room outside the assignment. Elijah's cave. Not judgment. Preparation. Your hunger, that's the compass. The thing that keeps you from settling into a counterfeit and calling it a destination. And your unfinishedness, that's the qualification. Not the obstacle. The qualification. 6 powers. And the reason you never recognize them as powers is that every single one of them arrives disguised as a weakness. That's not an accident. That is precisely how they stay hidden from everybody who would have talked you out of them. I want to go back to that woman in the 3rd row one more time. She came back to me about 8 months later. She'd started something, a small thing, a Saturday morning group in a borrowed room for foster mothers who had nobody to talk to. 11 women showed up the first time. She told me she'd sat in her car for 20 minutes before going in, absolutely certain she wasn't qualified. 30 years of changing sheets. 30 years underground, and when the stone finally moved, it moved because the root had been pushing the entire time she thought nothing was happening. She didn't become someone else. She just found out what she already was. That's what I want for you. Here's what I'd like you to do before you go. Down in the comments, tell me about one specific moment when you knew something before anyone told you. And you were right, and nobody believed you. Not a general feeling. A moment. Where you were standing. What you sensed. What happened afterward. I want you to see it written down in your own words. Because I don't think you've ever actually looked at the evidence. And I want you to scroll and see how many other people are describing the same thing. The stone hasn't moved yet. That's fine. Roots keep pushing in the dark, and the dark was never the enemy, it was just where the work gets done. Keep pushing.